first catastrophic tipping point for human-caused climate change, according to a new report by scientists in Europe. They say warm water, coral reefs now face a long-term decline, and warn the world is also on the brink of reaching other tipping points.
They were called insane for dumping thousands of beavers onto completely dead land. No trees, no water, nothing but cracked earth and ash. Everyone said it would fail, but then satellites picked up something that made scientists freeze. The underground water that had been dead for decades was moving again. Wildfires mysteriously dropped by 40%, and rivers that hadn't seen a single fish in years suddenly exploded with thousands of salmon.
Different tipping points that are highlighted in this report. The next one that to me is most notable is the West Antarctic ice sheet. So this is really a question of sea level rise. If you were to take away all of the ice that is in West Antarctica, that equates just by itself.
What these beavers did in just 2 years will make you question everything you thought you knew about nature. In the early 2000s, something started going terribly wrong in Washington state. The rivers that had flowed for thousands of years were drying up, the forests that lined their banks were burning, and the salmon that had always returned each spring simply stopped coming back. This wasn't just an environmental problem, it was a crisis that threatened the entire region's way of life. The Methow and Yakima watersheds, once lush and full of life, had become something almost unrecognizable. During the summer months, water temperatures in the streams climbed so high that salmon eggs couldn't survive. Adult fish trying to migrate upstream would turn back or die before reaching their spawning grounds. The few that made it found streams so shallow and warm that their eggs had almost no chance of hatching. According to researchers at Washington State University, summer water temperatures regularly exceeded the critical threshold of 20 degrees Celsius, which is essentially a death sentence for salmon reproduction. Then came the wildfires. Year after year, they swept through the region with increasing intensity. By the mid-2010 seconds, these fires had destroyed roughly 70% of the riparian forests, the green corridors of trees and vegetation that normally grow along rivers and streams. Without this protective canopy, the exposed ground baked under the relentless summer sun, stream banks eroded rapidly. Water that would have been shaded and cool now evaporated at an alarming rate. The soil itself began to change, becoming hydrophobic, meaning it actually repelled water rather than absorbing it. When the rains finally did come, usually in sudden autumn storms, the water couldn't soak into the scorched earth. Instead, it rushed across the surface, gathering speed and picking up everything in its path. Mud, ash, dead branches, and even the few remaining salmon eggs were swept away in thick black mudslides. These debris flows would tear through valleys, destroying what little remained of the stream habitats and leaving behind landscapes that looked more like construction sites than natural waterways. The dry season brought its own set of problems. During summer, up to 70% of the water flowing in the Yakima River wasn't fresh water at all. It was reused wastewater, recycled from agricultural and urban uses. This water carried high concentrations of nitrates, phosphates, and pesticides. Under the intense summer heat, these nutrients fueled massive algae blooms that turned sections of the river into what observers described as a toxic green soup. Fish couldn't survive in it. People couldn't use it for irrigation without risk. The river, once a source of life, had become a liability. Local farmers watched their access to clean water shrink year by year. Disputes over water rights became more common and more bitter. Every drop mattered when there simply wasn't enough to go around. Some farmers had to leave fields unplanted. Others watched crops wither despite their best efforts. The economic impact rippled through entire communities that had depended on agriculture for generations. Wildlife populations collapsed. The salmon decline was the most visible symptom, but it was far from the only one. Birds that had nested along the streams disappeared when their food sources vanished. Amphibians that needed cool, moist environments found none. Even insects, often taken for granted, became scarce. The entire food web was unraveling from the bottom up. Scientists and land managers recognized they were watching a feedback loop, a vicious cycle where each problem made the next one worse. Drought led to wildfires. Wildfires destroyed forests. Without forests, erosion accelerated and water evaporated faster. Faster evaporation meant less water for the next season. Less water meant more concentrated pollutants and higher temperatures. Higher temperatures killed more fish and plants. Dead vegetation meant more fuel for the next fire. And on it went. Something had to change. But what? The obvious solutions came with enormous price tags and uncertain outcomes. Water storage reservoirs, for instance, cost anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million each to construct. They also required significant alterations to the landscape, often flooding areas that had ecological value of their own. Environmental impact assessments took years. Community opposition was common. Even when the reservoirs were built, they addressed only one aspect of the problem: storing water without fixing the underlying ecosystem damage. Some groups proposed building extensive pipeline systems to bring water from larger rivers. These plans immediately ran into legal complications. Water rights in the western United States are complex and fiercely protected. Interstate water compacts, some dating back more than a century, govern who can use water from major rivers and how much they can take. Any new pipeline would need to navigate this legal maze, a process that could take decades and cost tens of millions of dollars. There was also the question of whether simply moving water around actually solved anything, or just shifted the problem somewhere else. A few experimental projects tried building artificial stream structures, essentially fake beaver dams made from logs, rocks, and posts. Pilot programs in Utah and Oregon showed mixed results. According to a 2017 study from the University of Idaho, these structures did slow water flow and create small ponds, which was encouraging. However, they also had significant drawbacks. Heavy rains often damaged or destroyed them. They required regular maintenance and repairs, which meant ongoing costs and labor. Most importantly, they couldn't replicate the complex ecological functions of natural beaver dams. Real beaver dams are living structures that the animals maintain and modify in response to changing conditions. The artificial versions were static, unable to adapt. As these various approaches failed to deliver results, frustration grew. The region was spending money and time on solutions that either didn't work or couldn't be implemented. Meanwhile, the land continued to deteriorate. Stream flows kept dropping, temperatures kept rising, the salmon population kept declining. It felt like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. Then someone suggested something that sounded almost absurdly simple. What if they brought back beavers? Not fake beaver dams, not beaver-inspired engineering, just actual beavers, doing what beavers naturally do. The idea was met with skepticism at first. How could a rodent, even a large one, possibly address problems that modern engineering and millions of dollars hadn't solved? It seemed too simple, too cheap, too much like giving up on human ingenuity in favor of hoping nature would fix itself. But as people looked more closely at the proposal, something interesting emerged. Farmers, ecologists, hydrologists, and indigenous community members, groups that often disagreed on environmental policy, all found themselves nodding along. There was something about the beaver idea that made sense to everyone, even if they couldn't quite articulate why at first. Perhaps it was because they all remembered, or had heard stories about, what the region used to be like before the beavers disappeared. The reason people started to believe in beavers wasn't actually about blind faith in nature. It was about understanding history. Before the Methow and Yakima regions became the parched landscapes of the 21st century, they had been something entirely different. Historical records and indigenous oral histories both pointed to the same truth. These watersheds had once been home to thousands of beaver dams. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Each one of those dams had functioned as a natural water storage system. They weren't just piles of sticks blocking streams. They were sophisticated structures that regulated water flow throughout the seasons. In spring, when snowmelt came rushing down from the mountains, beaver dams slowed that torrent, spreading it out over weeks instead of days. This prevented flash flooding and gave the water time to seep into the surrounding soil. In summer, when streams would otherwise run dry, the ponds behind beaver dams released water gradually, maintaining flow even during the hottest months. The dams trapped sediment, which built up over time to create rich wetland soils. They cooled water temperatures by creating deep pools shaded by the vegetation that grew around them. They supported entire ecosystems of plants, insects, fish, and other animals. When European fur traders arrived in North America in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found beaver populations so dense that the animals were almost considered a nuisance in some areas. The fur trade changed that rapidly. Beaver pelts were extraordinarily valuable in Europe, where they were used to make felt for hats and other luxury goods. Trappers systematically hunted beavers across the continent. In Washington state, as in most of the West, beavers were nearly wiped out by the late 1800s. A few small populations survived in remote areas, but the vast networks of dams that had shaped the landscape for millennia simply vanished. What happened next took decades to become apparent. Without beavers maintaining the dams, the structures eventually broke apart. Water that had been stored in thousands of ponds drained away. Stream channels that had been wide and shallow became narrow and deep, cutting down into their beds. Wetlands dried out, the water table dropped, trees that had depended on beaver ponds for moisture died off, and the entire hydrological character of the region changed. Rivers that had flowed year-round became seasonal. Springs that had never failed went dry. The American Fisheries Society later warned that losing beaver dams meant losing one of the most important wetland ecosystems in the American West. But by the time they issued that warning, most of the damage had already been done. People tried to compensate with engineering. If natural water storage was gone, they would create artificial storage. The problem was that human engineers approached water management with a completely different philosophy than beavers did. Engineers wanted water to move efficiently from point A to point B. They straightened meandering streams to speed up flow. They lined riverbeds with concrete to prevent erosion. They built channels designed to carry water away as quickly as possible. This approach worked well for preventing floods in urban areas, but it was terrible for the overall health of watersheds. In winter, when rain or snowmelt came, the water raced through these straightened, hardened channels and disappeared downstream in a matter of days. There was no time for it to soak into the ground, no opportunity for it to recharge aquifers or create wetlands. In summer, the same channels that had carried floods so efficiently now sat empty and bone dry. The water table, no longer recharged by beaver ponds and meandering streams, dropped lower each year. Wells had to be drilled deeper, springs dried up, and the cycle of drought and flood became more extreme with each passing decade. By the early 2000s, it had become clear to many researchers and land managers that conventional engineering solutions were not going to restore these watersheds. The problems were too complex and too interconnected. You couldn't fix the salmon decline without fixing water temperature. You couldn't fix water temperature without restoring riparian forests. You couldn't restore forests without stabilizing stream banks and maintaining summer water flow. And you couldn't do any of that without somehow recreating the water storage and slow release functions that beaver dams had once provided. That's when the Methow Beaver Project was born. In 2007, a coalition of conservation groups, government agencies, tribal nations, and private landowners came together with a plan that was both ambitious and remarkably simple. They would trap beavers that were causing problems in developed areas, places where the animals were flooding roads, cutting down ornamental trees, or damaging infrastructure, and relocate them to the degraded watersheds in the highlands. These were areas where beavers had once thrived but had been absent for more than a century. The logistics were more complicated than they might sound. You can't just drop a beaver anywhere and expect it to thrive. The project team had to identify suitable release sites, places with enough flowing water to attract the animals and enough woody vegetation nearby to provide food and building materials. Each beaver had to be trapped carefully, examined by veterinarians to ensure it was healthy, and fitted with a tracking device so researchers could monitor its movements and survival. The animals were given names, both to help researchers keep track of individuals and to build public support for the project. Then they were transported in specially designed carriers to their new homes in the mountains. The Colville tribe and other indigenous communities participated in some of the releases, performing traditional sage smoke ceremonies to welcome the beavers back to their ancestral lands. These ceremonies weren't just symbolic. For many Native American peoples in the Pacific Northwest, beavers hold cultural and spiritual significance as ecosystem engineers and providers. Their return represented not just an ecological restoration, but a cultural one as well. What made the project particularly attractive was its cost. Relocating a breeding pair of beavers, including all the trapping, veterinary care, transport, tracking equipment, and follow-up monitoring cost between $2,000 and $3,000. Compare that to the $500,000 to $2 million required to build a single artificial reservoir, and the economics became compelling. Even if you factored in the cost of multiple beaver releases to ensure some successes, the beaver approach was roughly 20 times cheaper than conventional engineering solutions. By 2021, the Methow watershed alone had received more than 240 beavers released at over 50 different sites. The success rate, defined as beavers that stayed in the area and established territories, was 64%. That might not sound impressive at first, but for highly territorial animals like beavers, it was actually remarkable. Beavers are particular about their habitat. They need the right combination of water flow, food availability, and denning sites. The fact that nearly 2/3 of relocated beavers chose to stay and make a go of it suggested that the release sites had been well chosen, and that the animals recognized these degraded landscapes as potential homes worth investing in. When the first beavers were released, expectations were modest. Project organizers hoped the animals would survive, adapt to their new surroundings, and perhaps build a few small dams. No one anticipated how quickly and how dramatically the landscape would begin to change. Within just a few weeks of being released at some sites, beavers had already felled their first trees and begun construction on dams. These initial structures were nothing spectacular, just 2 or 3 feet high, made from whatever branches and mud the beavers could gather. But their impact was immediate and visible. Water that had been rushing through narrow channels slowed down. It began to pool behind the dams, creating ponds where there had been only trickling streams or dry gravel beds. The ponds weren't large, but they didn't need to be. Their mere existence changed the local hydrology. Water spread outward through the soil, following underground channels and seeping into areas that had been dry for years. Tree roots, particularly willows and cottonwoods that had been barely surviving, suddenly had access to moisture. Green grass appeared on stream banks that had been bare dirt and rock. Small changes, but unmistakable. The dams acted as what researchers called ecological smart valves. In spring, they captured snowmelt, holding it back instead of letting it race downstream and out to the Pacific Ocean. This stored water was then released slowly over the following weeks and months, maintaining stream flow well into summer. Underground water channels extended hundreds of meters from each dam, creating ribbons of moisture through the landscape. Soil that had been hard and dry became softer and more permeable. As moisture levels increased, so did biological activity. The ground temperature dropped, microbes that had been dormant became active again, earthworms returned, insects followed. Within just a few years of the beaver reintroductions, scientists began documenting changes that exceeded even their most optimistic predictions. Washington State University researchers conducted soil analyses around beaver dam sites and found that organic carbon levels had increased by 30 to 50% compared to areas without beaver activity. This wasn't a minor improvement. Organic carbon is fundamental to soil health. It improves water retention, provides nutrients for plants, supports microbial communities, and creates the kind of rich, dark soil that can sustain diverse plant life. The beavers, simply by building dams and creating wetlands, were essentially manufacturing topsoil at a rate that would normally take centuries. This enriched soil became the foundation for plant recovery. Willows were among the first to respond, sending out new shoots along the stream banks where moisture had returned. Cottonwoods, which had been struggling as scattered individuals, began forming groves again. Cattails appeared in the shallow edges of beaver ponds. Sedges and rushes colonized the wet meadows that formed around the larger dam complexes. Each plant species brought its own contribution to the recovering ecosystem. Their roots stabilized soil and prevented erosion. Their leaves provided shade. Their stems and seeds fed insects and birds. And crucially, their presence attracted more beavers, because these animals need woody vegetation both for food and for building materials. The wildfire issue, which had seemed like a separate and insurmountable problem, also began to improve. The connection wasn't immediately obvious to everyone, but researchers who studied fire ecology understood it well. Wildfires spread most easily through dry vegetation and across landscapes where there's no moisture to slow them down. Beaver wetlands created natural fire breaks. The saturated soil around ponds and streams simply wouldn't burn. The lush green vegetation that grew in these areas had much higher moisture content than the dried grasses and shrubs in surrounding areas, making it far more resistant to ignition. A study published in the Journal of Ecological Applications examined 5 major wildfires that occurred over a 10-year period in regions where beavers had been reintroduced. The findings were striking. In areas with active beaver dams, only 2 to 3% of trees were lost to fire damage. In comparable areas without beaver presence, tree loss reached as high as 60%. The wetland ecosystems that beavers created didn't just survive the fires, they actually protected surrounding areas, reducing the overall intensity and spread of the blazes. Some land managers calculated that this fire protection was saving between $15,000 and $25,000 annually in firefighting costs in certain watersheds, not to mention the incalculable value of homes, timber, and wildlife habitat that was spared. As forests grew back along the stream corridors, they created shade that had been absent for decades. This shade proved critical for water temperature regulation. Direct sunlight on shallow streams can raise water temperatures dramatically, sometimes by as much as 10 degrees Celsius between morning and afternoon. The restored riparian forests blocked much of that solar radiation, keeping water temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius, which is the threshold that salmon eggs need to survive. Temperature monitoring stations recorded consistent drops in summer water temperatures in streams where beavers had established territories and where tree canopy had recovered. The salmon responded exactly as biologists had hoped. Chinook salmon, which had been largely absent from many tributaries, began returning to spawn in streams where beaver dams had created suitable habitat. Researchers conducting fish surveys found that the density of juvenile Chinook in areas with beaver dams was 5 times higher than in areas without them. Even more encouraging, the survival rate from egg to juvenile fish increased from 27% to 33%. That might sound like a modest improvement, but in population terms, it's enormous. A 6% increase in survival at that critical life stage can mean the difference between a declining population and a growing one over the course of a few generations. The structure of beaver dams turned out to be ideal for fish passage. Unlike concrete dams, which create hard barriers that fish cannot cross, beaver dams are porous. Water flows through gaps between the logs and branches. Fish can swim through these gaps, or, during high water, swim over the top of the dam. The dams create a series of stepped pools, which actually make it easier for fish to move upstream during low water periods, when they might otherwise be blocked by shallow riffles. Some researchers described beaver dams as creating salmon staircases, though the beavers certainly weren't building them with that intention. Encouraged by these results, some conservation groups began experimenting with beaver dam analogues, human-built structures designed to mimic the form and function of real beaver dams. At a stream restoration project in Oregon, workers installed more than 120 of these structures, using logs, posts, and natural materials. Within 2 years, they documented a survival rate increase of more than 50% for juvenile steelhead trout, another native fish species that had been in decline. The beaver dam analogues worked, but they required significant human labor to build and maintain, and they still couldn't fully replicate the adaptive quality of real beaver dams, which the animals constantly modify in response to changing water levels and conditions. As water and vegetation returned, so did the rest of the ecological community. Moose, which need wetland vegetation for food, returned to areas they had abandoned. Mink and muskrats, both semi-aquatic mammals, re-established populations along the streams. Waterfowl, including ducks and herons, began nesting in and around beaver ponds. Amphibians like frogs and salamanders, which require water for reproduction and moist environments for survival, reappeared after absences of 10 or 20 years in some locations. Even dragonflies and other aquatic insects, which spend their larval stages underwater, rebounded in numbers that hadn't been seen in decades. This cascade of returning species demonstrated something that ecologists call a trophic cascade, where the reintroduction of one key species triggers effects that ripple through multiple levels of the food web. The beavers changed the physical environment by building dams. Those physical changes allowed plants to grow. The plants supported insects. The insects fed birds and fish. The fish fed larger predators, Each level of the ecosystem began functioning again because the foundation, the water storage and habitat creation provided by beavers, had been restored. The economic benefits became apparent as well, particularly for farmers and ranchers. Okanogan County released a report comparing the costs of different watershed restoration approaches. Their analysis showed that traditional engineering restoration, using excavators, imported materials, and professional contractors, cost roughly 40 times more than beaver-based restoration for comparable results. A single beaver dam that remained stable for 3 years, which most well-built beaver dams easily do, could save individual farmers between $3,000 and $7,000 each dry season, just in reduced electricity and irrigation costs. The water stored and slowly released by the dam meant farmers could pump less groundwater, use their irrigation systems less intensively, and still maintain adequate soil moisture for crops. The success in Washington caught the attention of conservationists and land managers worldwide. The beaver model began spreading to other regions facing similar problems. In Canada, beavers had never been as heavily depleted as in the United States, but their ecosystem role was still underappreciated until a remarkable incident in 2011 near the village of Little Buffalo in northern Alberta. A pipeline leaked more than 28,000 barrels of oil. Environmental disaster seemed inevitable. Emergency response teams were still mobilizing when observers noticed something unexpected. A beaver dam downstream had trapped much of the oil, preventing it from spreading further down the river system. The dam acted as an accidental containment barrier, giving cleanup crews time to respond before the oil contaminated a much larger area. It was an unplanned, unintended demonstration of how beaver infrastructure could sometimes perform functions that human emergency systems couldn't match for speed or effectiveness. In the Chesapeake Bay region of the eastern United States, researchers studying water quality found that beaver ponds were removing up to 45% of the nitrogen flowing through them. Excess nitrogen from agricultural runoff and sewage is one of the primary causes of algae blooms that create dead zones in coastal waters. Removing nitrogen from water before it reaches the bay required either expensive chemical treatment or natural filtration through wetlands. Beaver ponds provided that filtration for free, and they did it continuously without any energy input or maintenance costs. Wastewater treatment plants that could achieve similar nitrogen removal rates had to invest millions of dollars in infrastructure and then pay ongoing operating costs for chemicals and electricity. In Wood Buffalo National Park in Alberta, scientists discovered what they called the Beaver Wonder, a dam complex stretching 850 meters, more than half a mile long. Satellite imagery and dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, suggested that 7 generations of beavers had worked on this structure over several decades. It was longer than the famous Hoover Dam, built entirely by animals, using nothing but instinct, teeth, and persistence. The structure had created a wetland complex covering several square kilometers, visible from space, supporting countless other species. The most recent and perhaps most dramatic example came from the Czech Republic in May 2025. The Bodin wetland had been a degraded landscape for years. Government agencies spent 7 years working through environmental assessments, permits, and planning processes. They invested more than 30 million Czech koruna, attempting to restore the wetland using conventional methods. The results were disappointing. Then, almost as an experiment, 8 beavers were released into the area. Within 2 days, they had built a series of dams. Within weeks, crayfish that hadn't been seen in the area for years reappeared. Rare green frogs returned. Migratory birds began using the renewed wetland as a stopover. Ecologists examining the results admitted publicly that the beavers had done the job better than human-designed plans would have, and they had done it in a fraction of the time, and at virtually no cost. Despite all the success stories and ecological victories, it would be misleading to suggest that beaver reintroduction is a perfect solution without complications. The reality on the ground is more nuanced, and understanding both the benefits and the challenges is essential for anyone considering this approach to ecosystem restoration. The problems that arise aren't failures of the concept itself, but rather the inevitable friction that occurs when wild animals and human land use overlap in complex ways. One of the most frequent sources of conflict happens in agricultural areas. Beavers are instinct-driven animals. When they see a tree near water, they don't evaluate whether it's a wild cottonwood or a carefully cultivated apple tree worth hundreds of dollars. They simply see potential building material or food. In Okanogan County, Washington, numerous orchard owners have reported significant economic losses. A single beaver, working through one night, can fell a dozen fruit trees. Over the course of a season, a family of beavers can destroy enough trees to cost a farmer several $1,000s in lost production, not to mention the years of growth time needed to replace mature trees. The dam building instinct creates additional problems when it happens in the wrong locations. A beaver dam built across an irrigation ditch can completely block water flow that farmers depend on for their crops. Dams built near roads can flood culverts and wash out rural access, routes, sometimes stranding residents or cutting off emergency vehicle access. When beavers build drainage systems designed to protect farmland from seasonal flooding, their dams can reverse years of drainage work and turn productive fields back into swamps. These aren't theoretical concerns, they're real problems that real people face, and dismissing them as unimportant would be both unfair and counterproductive. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife receives hundreds of beaver-related complaints each year. According to their records, roughly 15 to 20% of these complaints come from agricultural areas and involve irrigation or crop damage. These complaints can't simply be ignored. Farmers operate on tight margins, and unexpected losses from wildlife can be economically devastating, especially for small family operations. Finding ways to balance beaver conservation with agricultural viability requires ongoing dialogue, compensation programs, and sometimes physical interventions like tree guards or flow control devices that allow beavers to build dams without completely blocking water flow. Infrastructure damage extends beyond agriculture. Beaver dams, while generally stable, can fail during extreme weather events. When a dam breaks suddenly after heavy rain, the accumulated water behind it is released all at once. This surge can cause localized flooding downstream, particularly dangerous if homes or businesses are located in the flood path. While beaver dam failures are far less catastrophic than human dam failures, they still pose risks that need to be managed and monitored, especially in areas where development has occurred near streams where beavers are active. The physical requirements for successful beaver habitat also limit where these animals can be effectively reintroduced. Urban and suburban areas are generally unsuitable. Beavers need woody vegetation, particularly willows, aspens, and cottonwoods, for food and building materials. Streams that have been completely channelized in concrete are useless to beavers. Areas where streams only flow seasonally, drying up completely for months at a time, cannot support permanent beaver populations. The animals need year-round water to maintain their dams and lodges. Regions with very steep terrain pose challenges as well, since beavers prefer gentle gradients where their dams can create broad ponds rather than narrow, deep pools. Legal and regulatory barriers create another layer of complexity. The United States has no federal beaver protection policy. Instead, management authority is delegated to individual states, and those states have widely varying approaches. Some states classify beavers as protected wildlife that can only be trapped with special permits. Others treat them as nuisance animals that landowners can remove at will. Some states have active relocation programs. Others prohibit moving beavers across county or watershed boundaries due to concerns about spreading diseases or disrupting existing populations. As many as 40 states lack clear, comprehensive beaver conservation policies, which means protection and restoration efforts depend heavily on local political will and community support. This patchwork of regulations creates confusion and inconsistency. A beaver restoration project that would be encouraged in one county might be prohibited just across the county line. Landowners who want to remove problem beavers might find themselves tangled in permit requirements and waiting periods, while their crops or property suffer damage. Conservation groups trying to relocate beavers might spend months navigating bureaucratic requirements, only to have their permits denied for reasons that seem arbitrary. Without coordinated policy frameworks, even the most well-intentioned restoration efforts can stumble over legal obstacles. Social acceptance is another challenge that often gets overlooked. Not everyone sees beavers as beneficial ecosystem engineers. Some people view them as destructive pests that damage property and complicate water management. Changing these perceptions requires education, outreach, and often direct engagement with affected communities. When conservation groups simply show up and release beavers without consulting local residents, particularly farmers and ranchers whose livelihoods depend on the land, resentment and resistance are almost guaranteed. Successful beaver restoration programs have learned that community involvement from the planning stages onward is essential. People are far more likely to tolerate beaver-related problems if they feel heard, respected, and included in decision-making processes. Despite these legitimate challenges and limitations, beaver restoration remains one of the most cost-effective and ecologically sound approaches to watershed recovery developed in recent decades. The key is recognizing that beavers aren't a universal solution for every landscape or situation. They're a tool, an incredibly effective one in the right context, but still just one option among many that land managers need to consider. Looking toward the future, the organizations that pioneered beaver restoration in Washington are entering a new and more sophisticated phase of their work. The Methow Beaver Project and the Beaver Restoration Coalition are no longer simply catching beavers in one place and releasing them in another. They're integrating traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous communities with cutting-edge monitoring technology to create adaptive management systems that can track results in real time and adjust strategies based on what the data reveals. Researchers are now deploying thermal imaging sensors around beaver dam sites to monitor water temperature fluctuations throughout the day and across seasons. Soil moisture monitors buried at various depths and distances from dams provide continuous data on how water disperses through underground channels. Automated wildlife cameras capture images of every animal that visits beaver ponds, creating a visual record of biodiversity recovery. Some programs are even experimenting with artificial intelligence systems that can analyze drone footage to count dams, measure pond surface area, and track changes in vegetation coverage, without requiring researchers to hike to every remote site. The data being collected goes far beyond simple beaver counts. Scientists are documenting groundwater level changes, measuring the return of migratory bird species, analyzing crop yields on farms near beaver restoration sites, and calculating the rate at which riparian forests are recovering. A 2024 report from the Washington State Department of Ecology synthesized multiple data sources and concluded that areas where beavers had been active for at least 3 years were holding 15 to 20% more water during the summer months compared to similar areas without beavers. The same report noted wildfire risk reduction of up to 40% in areas with established beaver populations and documented that aquatic plant diversity had doubled in streams where beavers were present compared to those without them. These results have encouraged an expansion of restoration goals. Washington State has announced plans to restore at least 500 kilometers of headwater streams using beaver-based approaches over the next 10 years. This isn't just an ecological objective, it's also a cultural and educational initiative. Training programs are being developed to teach indigenous community members, farmers, schoolchildren, and even urban residents about beaver ecology and watershed management. The goal is to create a generation of people who understand how these ecosystems function and who can participate as active stewards rather than passive observers. Imagine for a moment what the Pacific Northwest could look like if these plans succeed. Instead of landscapes where rivers run dry every summer and communities fight over every remaining drop of water, picture a region where streams flow year-round, where thousands of salmon return each season, where farmers and wildlife coexist in a system that benefits both. It's not a return to some pre-human wilderness. It's something different, a working landscape where human needs and ecological health aren't in constant conflict, but instead support each other through thoughtful management and a willingness to let natural processes do the heavy lifting. The lesson here extends beyond beavers and beyond Washington State. In an era where environmental problems often feel overwhelming, and where proposed solutions usually involve massive budgets, advanced technology, and years of planning, the beaver restoration story offers something different. It suggests that sometimes the most effective approach isn't to engineer something new, but to restore something old. Nature already developed highly effective systems over millions of years of evolution. Beavers shaped North American waterways for longer than humans have existed as a species. Their absence created problems. Their return is solving those problems. This doesn't mean abandoning technology or dismissing human ingenuity. The monitoring systems being used to track beaver restoration are sophisticated. The coordination required to manage these programs across multiple agencies, tribes, and private landowners is complex. But the core of the solution is remarkably simple. Give beavers appropriate habitat and then step back and let them work. There's something almost humbling about watching a creature that weighs perhaps 20 kilograms accomplish what millions of dollars and teams of engineers struggled to achieve. It challenges assumptions about human exceptionalism and technological superiority. It raises uncomfortable questions about how much environmental damage has resulted from the belief that nature needs to be controlled, straightened, channelized, and managed into submission rather than worked with as a partner. The hundreds of beavers now living in the Methow, Yakima, and Okanogan watersheds didn't solve every problem. They didn't eliminate drought or stop climate change. But they did bring dead streams back to life. They did restore water to parched land. They did create habitat where salmon could spawn again. They did all of this using nothing more than wood, water, mud, and the instincts refined over 10 million years of evolution. If this story demonstrates anything, it's that ecological restoration doesn't have to be impossibly complicated or prohibitively expensive. Sometimes the most powerful intervention is knowing when to step back, when to trust processes that worked long before humans arrived, and when to let the original engineers reclaim their role. The beavers are back, the water is returning, the land is healing, and perhaps the most important thing humans can do now is pay attention, learn from what's happening, and consider where else this approach might work. Because when it comes to restoring damaged ecosystems, the answers we're looking for might already exist. We just need the wisdom to recognize them and the humility to let them work.